Testing 1, 2, 3. Testing 1, 2, 3. Torah. That is not the air conditioner. I don't think. That noise is the heavens that have. You don't have assigned seats, but you need to sit apart. But, you know, I know you've all been schmoozing in the back, but it's still the policy. So we're going to start in the blue packet that was on the back table, the Holy Tears. But before we do that, I'll give you just a little bit of background on the book of Eicha, or the book of Lamentations. Or maybe you guys can give each other background. I don't know. Do we have any Zoomies? Or just us roomies? Okay. Hi, Kim. All right. So the book of Eicha, the book of Lamentations, was written after the destruction of the first temple. We're going to read it a little bit in Hebrew and mostly in English later, and you can hear really how horrific it was. And in the book of Eicha, everybody cries, all right? The reader cries, the witnesses cry, the city of Jerusalem itself cries. The only one who doesn't cry is God. And the ancient rabbis had some discomfort about that, which we're going to see. And so as we do this Holy Tears, it's taking a look at weeping in our tradition, in particular around the book of Eicha. But then the rabbis imagine God also moved to tears. So it's pretty interesting. I feel kind of far away from you all. But so the book of Eicha, we're going to be here in source 1, and I'll read it out loud. Bitterly she weeps in the night, her cheek wet with tears. There's none to comfort her. Of all her friends, all her allies have betrayed her. They have become her foes. Unclear if this is a person living in Jerusalem, or if it's Jerusalem herself, right? Personified as a woman. And then the writer weeps. For these things do I weep, my eyes flow with tears. Far from me is any comforter who might revive my spirit. My children are forlorn, for the foe has prevailed. And then again, my eyes are spent with tears, right? If this is chapter 2. My heart is in tumult. My being melts away over the ruin of my poor people, as babes and sucklings languish in the squares of the city, right? So there's just death and destruction and weeping. And then finally, their heart cried out to God, right? O wall of fair Zion, shed tears like a torrent day and night. Give yourself no respite, your eyes no rest. So even the walls of the city should be weeping for the destruction. So we see this throughout Lamentations, this like call to weep, to mourn, to cry, the great losses and the horrific trauma and tragedy that befell not just Jerusalem, but all the people who lived there. All right. So, but like I said, God never cries. In the book of Lamentation, God is angry, and there's not really comfort, except a teeny tiny bit at the end. So now we've got to fast forward over 1,000 years. Not over 1,000 years. We got to fast forward to several hundred years, right, to the destruction now of the second temple. And that's when the rabbis, the sages who wrote the Mishnah and the Talmud lived. They lived post-destruction of the second temple. So they're living in this, some of them lived through the destruction, but more of them were living in the shadow of the destruction, rebuilding Judaism. And in that process, in their mourning for their more recent loss, and the loss of Jewish sovereignty, and they bring God into the tragedy. And that's what we're going to take a look at, into their tragedy. And that's what we'll take a look at. So if you look at source number 5, this is from the Talmud. This one's from Sanhedrin. And they're interpreting that first. So I'm going to so here's what the Talmud does. or what the rabbis did, is they took weird verses and they expound on them, all right? Or they take what's called, I had a teacher call it the exegetical itch, all right? That like spot in the text that doesn't make sense. So what are they commenting on? They're going to comment on the first one, the first text, which is Lamentations chapter 1, verse 2, bitterly she weeps in the night. That's the translation. But the Hebrew is becho tivkeh, like she cries, oh, she cries. It's like emphasized, all right? So here they're translating it as bitterly weeping, but this is just weeping she weeps, kind of like that, right? So they're saying, what does it mean, becho tivkeh? Why is it, gosh, that storm is ferocious. Why is it repeated? And they're saying that there's two cries, okay? She's not crying once, she's crying twice. What are they? According to Rabbi Yochanan, one is the crying over the destruction of the first temple, and one's a cry over the destruction of the second temple. And so even into the book of Lamentations, which is written after the destruction of the first temple, they're imagining, right, the future destruction, the destruction they've lived through. So they see this weeping being forward-facing. And why is she crying at night? Well, at night, that refers to the spies who went up to Israel and came back with a poor report, and that happened at night. So they're trying to show, even in this one verse of Lamentations, all the things that happened on Tishah B'Av that would be negative. And all the congregation lifted up their voice. The people cried that night. All right. And then we get more interpretation. So Rabbah's quoting Rabbi Yochanan, who says, the day that they heard the spies' report was Tishah B'Av, the 9th of Av. And the Holy One said to the Jewish people, you cried an unwarranted cry, and so I'll give you a reason to cry for generations. Right? Like a nasty parent, okay? Or a bully, right? Why are you crying? I'll give you something to cry about, right? You're crying because they came back with a false report. Well, this is now a day that's going to go down in history as a tragic time. And then they have different interpretations. Okay, well, or maybe that's not why it says at night in this verse. Maybe it is that, anyone who cries at night, well, it's really quiet so other people can hear, right? Your voice carries at night because there's not other sound, so she's crying at night because noise carries. Or maybe people who cry at night, the heavens cry with them. The stars and the constellations cry too. All right, yeah, right? The heavens are weeping. And then this last one, I love this. No, people who cry at night, anyone who hears their voice and is touched by their suffering cries with them. And they have an example. There was an incident involving a woman, the neighbor of Rabban Gamliel, whose son died, and she would cry over his death at night. She cried every night that her son had died. She would cry herself to sleep. And when Rabban Gamliel heard her voice, he cried with her until his eyelashes fell out. He wept too. When we hear and we witness the sorrow of another person, we are also moved to sorrow, right? So this night that's reflecting on the mourning and the sorrow of our people becomes ours, but it's a call, I think, to empathy, right? Even the rabbis understood. And so as we think about what's holy tears, what are sacred tears, when we are moved by the suffering of another, what's more sacred than that? Okay, and now we're going to switch. We've got another topic. Again, the topic is holy tears, but we have a new text, okay? And this is Rabbi Elazar, who said, since the day the temple was destroyed, the gates of prayer were locked. So you have to imagine the temple had gates. We reenact this at Ne'ilah. The temple compound was gated, and people would come in. The gates were opened in the morning, and they were closed at night. And so if you came to do an offering, you couldn't get in if the gates were closed, right? So the idea of Ne'ilah is we want to get our prayers in before the gates closed, those gates of the temple. Well, this is saying the temple was destroyed. So those gates that people would walk in to offer their sacrifices and their prayers to seek forgiveness, those gates were closed. They're closed. They're done. The gates of prayer are closed. And then it quotes our book again. It quotes Eicha. Though I plead and call out, God shuts out my prayer. The temple was destroyed. The prayers are shut out. And yet, despite the fact that the gates of prayers were locked with the destruction of the temple, the gates of tears were not locked. The gates of tears are always open. So what does this mean in rabbinic theology? It means that, and this is, again, right, like we pray the right way and our prayers are answered, which actually isn't my theology, but certainly was the Mishnah and the Talmudic rabbis' theology. They would pray and their prayers wouldn't be answered because they wanted to be saved, right? Or they wanted a return to sovereignty. They wanted to get back to the good old days, but the gates of prayer were closed. They couldn't make it happen. But the tears are heard. God hears our emotion, and God is moved to respond by human suffering and human emotion. Okay, now we're going to go again. This is now on page 3 of 4. It's text number 7. So this is from Eicha Rabbah, a collection of Midrash. They're commenting on Lamentations. I know. See? The heavens are weeping, everybody. So the Blessed Holy One said to the angels, let's go, you and I, so that we may see what the enemies have done to my house. So let's go see what happened to the holy temple. Right? So straight away, the Holy Blessed One and the angels went off, and Jeremiah was in the lead. Now, the prophet Jeremiah is the one who's attributed to write the book of Lamentations. Book of Eicha is attributed to Jeremiah. And when the Blessed Holy One saw the temple, he said, this is indeed my house, and this is my resting place, into which my enemies have entered and done as they please. So God sees the destruction and sees that the temple was defiled. And at that moment, the emphasis is my own, the Holy One began crying and said, woe is me over my house. My children, where are you? My priests, where are you? My intimates, how do they translate that? What can I do for you? I gave you warning, but you did not repent your ways. I wanted you to do tshuva, but you didn't. Oh, my intimates is my beloved ones. My beloved, Ohavai. Ohavai, where are you? My loved ones, where are you? So now God witnesses the destruction that, according to the rabbis, God wanted to avoid with warnings and the prophets and saying, come on, don't do this, don't do this, don't do this. And the destruction came and it breaks God's heart. And it breaks God's heart. So throughout the book of Eicha, there's, God is not weeping. Everybody else is. But now finally the rabbis imagine God witnessing the destruction, and God weeps too. God also is moved to tears. And then here we go, speaking of God's tears, from another source. This is now Talmud Brachot. Rav Katina was walking along the road when he came to the entrance of the house of a necromancer. All right? This is great because the whole passage, by the way, is not about God's tears. This passage, which this is taken from, is all about how you shouldn't consult the dead, and it's really bad. But now, by the way, since we're talking about all the things that you're not supposed to do, here's a story of a rabbi who did it. And here's what happened. So Rav Katina was walking, and he came to this house. And as he was going to the entrance, the earthquake rumbled. And he said, does this necromancer know what's the earthquake? What's causing this earthquake? Do you know? And the necromancer shouted right from the house, Katina, Katina, why wouldn't I know? The earthquake occurred when the Holy One, when the Blessed Holy One remembers God's children who are suffering among the nations of the world. When God remembers us and remembers our suffering, what happens? God sheds 2 tears into the great sea, and the sound of their reverberation of God's weeping is heard from one end of the earth to the other, and that is an earthquake. Now, this is not a scientific explanation, right? But even, God's sorrow shakes the foundations of the earth. All right, and then finally we've got Chagiga, another Talmudic text. The sages taught that there are 3 types of people for whom the Holy One, blessed be He, or the Holy Blessed One, cries for every day. Okay, no, guys, God doesn't only cry and send an earthquake when God remembers sorrow. God cries every day for 3 types of people. Good Lord. And literally. And here are they. For a person who's able to engage in Torah study but doesn't engage in it. God weeps for folks who could be learning Torah and don't. And for the person who's unable to engage in Torah study but nevertheless tries and engages in it. For people who maybe don't have the acumen to study or want to study, but for some reason they can't, but they try anyways. God cries over that person too, who longs to study Torah and who tries but just can't quite get it. And God also cries for a leader who lords over the community, right? God's tears are also shed for leadership who abuse their position. This is unbelievable. All right, so here we go. So that's God's tears. So why does God cry? When folks could fulfill their potential, but they don't. When folks yearn to be something that they're unable to be or to engage in a way that they can't. And God weeps at our sorrow, and God weeps when our leaders abuse their power. Like, isn't that just so striking, right? So we see here going from the absence of God in the text, not absence of God, absence of God's negative, like sadness, right? Or accompanying the people who are facing trauma and destruction and exile and loss and death and starvation and we'll read it, it's terrible. So we go from God being almost the oppositional force to God's heart breaking at our suffering, and not just our suffering, but when we can't even fulfill our potential. So as we think about, right, like, what does this holiday mean today? Because we do have a sovereign Jewish nation in the land of Israel, right? And I think most of us, I'm going to make an assumption, are not yearning to go back to animal sacrifice. So how do we relate to this day of mourning, and how do we make sense of the theology, not just the reward and punishment, and this is punishment theology in Eicha, but also the compassionate God who's moved by our tears, who hears our prayers, that the gates of tears are always open, they always reach God, and God cries with us. And what is that meant to make us do, especially at this moment, right, of time and history in our lives? So here is a quote from Michael Kagan. It's on the back. It's okay. Now we pray for the best possible outcome. That's always the prayer. When you live right by the police station and the ambulance and the fire department, we get to say that a lot, best possible outcome. So the prayer, though, when you hear sirens, always for the best possible outcome. All right, so Michael Kagan, PhD, wrote, "Can you imagine if the entire world would for one day sit on the floor weeping, grieving, and fasting for the suffering that we have inflicted upon each other and the planet? One day when we all, right, when we recognize the humanity of others collectively, that they suffer as we suffer, just grieving the pain and our collective loss of heart. Can you imagine? Surely that would be the birth of the Mashiach. Surely that would bring Messiah, right? If we could all collectively witness the suffering of others and let it penetrate. If we could have the empathy to weep for those who suffer in our world today, suffering sometimes that we cause. Can you imagine? And so I think, right, that's the sacred tears. The tears that mourn the loss, but the tears that are there in empathy as well. And so as I struggle very often with the theology of this day, right, of Tishah B'Av, where I'm not really mourning because, well, I don't know that I want a third temple. And this all happened 2,000 years ago, 2,500 years ago, right? It's not fresh for us, but the suffering of people certainly is. And my heart is so often hardened, right? Because we have to. But what if for one day we could weep for the sorrow that befalls our fellow human beings, if we could see one another's humanity and recognize that even though many of us put on a brave face, underneath there is this pain that we carry around, right? Wouldn't that be sacred indeed? And so I bring you in closing, and then we'll do one of the poems from Psalms 126, which you may recognize. This is in Birkat Hamazon. Hazorim bedim. All right. Berina yikzoru alochen. Okay. Those who sow in tears shall reap with Rina, with songs of joy. Right? Will joyfully celebrate. Though a person goes along weeping, carrying the seed bag, right? He'll come back with songs of joy, carrying the sheaves. Sorrow and joy are part of the cycle of life. And if we pretend, right, like I think in America, we pretend like nobody's ever supposed to be unhappy, or I'm sorry I'm crying, or I should just get over it. But if we recognize, right, that we can go forth in tears, but we'll come back in joy, that there's a time for all of it, and that the sorrow can indeed be transformed, that the seeds that are planted at times of challenge and difficulty, they flourish ultimately, and that we too have the power to turn mourning or loss or tragedy or trauma into tears of joy, into celebration, that we can find those silver linings, or we can see how out of those times of suffering, beautiful things can come forth. And our ancestors ultimately did that. And I think that's part of what Tishah B'Av lets us do, is that we have this historical perspective, right? That yes, there was sorrow and destruction, not once, but twice. And yes, our people have befallen so many tragedies, and yet here we are, right? We have remained Judaism. We have this religion that can nourish us and nurture us and guide us through the world, and this rich tradition that was built in many ways by these rabbis in the shadow of destruction. And we are, I wish I could say we're at the end of the pandemic. We are certainly not in the heat of it, right? But it's not over yet. And I think for me, there's been this back and forth on like, what are those silver linings, without dismissing the suffering and without dismissing the pain and without dismissing the loss and the trauma and the challenge. How do we say, okay, but I know that if we sow in tears, we can reap in songs of joy, right? I know that we can plant weeping, but ultimately the sheaves, the nourishment will come forth. And how can I be a part of that process? Not ignoring the weeping, and being moved by the suffering of others, moved to help, right, or support, without ignoring the loss, and to see the humanity and have that move us to something better. And I think that's part of the message of Tishah B'Av, is that we remember where we've come from and the mourning of our people, and yet we can be moved to Chadesh Yameinu Kakedem, to renew our days like old, that we call upon God at the end, right, to help us move forward, but we also help each other move forward. And we also can see and look back that we stand on the shoulders of generations who have been able to move forward in spite of the tragedy that's befallen the Jewish people. And not only are we now living in the most successful Jewish community in history, right? We've got humor. We've got Jewish jokes, right? Like there's so much richness that has come from the tragedies of the past. So we should sow in tears, but reap in joy. Normally when I teach, we get to talk back and forth, but because I have to be up here, it's a little bit harder. So I'll just open it up. Does anyone, and I'm gonna, is anybody still on? Is Kim still on? Okay, so does anybody want to just respond or reflect on the Holy Tears? Any of these texts you're welcome to, but I would just invite you to go to the middle, and then we can all hear you, and our Zoomies can hear us Roomies as well. So any thoughts on Holy Tears? No? Did it resonate? More or less? Okay. So now I'm going to invite you to this White Sheet, the poem by Rabbi Rachel Barenblatt, who's a writer and poet and author and rabbi. And she wrote Eicha, how. She wrote this last year, I believe. So many died in isolation, intubated, untouchable. How did the doctors and nurses bear their despair? How can we move through the world when so many are mourning? Light a candle for every COVID-19 death and face a sea of flames. And when they gutter and go dark, we wail with our aloneness again. If we tore our clothes for every rip in the fabric of our lives, every ventilator and heart that stopped, who would wear anything but rags? And then she's got another poem that we'll read at the end of our, like the whole thing, all right? Which is called How To. So Eicha means how, right? Or alas, or how. And her second poem, How To, I believe was written a year later, right? It was written for this Tishah B'Av. And it's how do we go forth despite the grief and the loss? It's the Eicha question. How and how to, right? How to respond. So it is still technically Shabbat, but we're almost out, which means we can take a quick little pause, but we'll begin our service tonight. What's going to happen is we'll do Mariv. Mariv on Tishah B'Av is recited spoken. We don't sing. So we now adopt a posture of mourning. Traditionally, the book of Eicha is read in the dark with people sitting on the floor with their shoes off as signs of mourning. So, but again, we won't necessarily do that and in candlelight. So once Shabbat's out, I will light those candles and turn off a few of the lights in here, not so many that you can't see and read, but enough to really change the mood and get us somber. Well, Eicha is read in the middle of the Mariv service. So Matt's going to lead us in Mariv. If you have the black booklet, it is in here, or we can find it in the Siddur. So Matt will lead us, and then in the middle, we switch over to oh, there you go. Do you want the podium, the stender? It's on the right. So do you see it down on the floor? I mean the left, sorry. The other right. Stage right. There you go. So we are in the black book, the Tishah B'Av book, on page 1. And as always, you're just welcome to read along about some of the history. We're on page 1. We rise for the Baruch.
Yes. Thank you, Rabbi.
Yeah, go ahead.
Thank you, Elaine and David, for making the minyan when you walked in. Yes. Okay, we rise for Baruch. Baruch et Adonai Hamvarach.
Baruch Adonai Hamvarach le'olam va'ed.
Baruch Adonai Hamvarach le'olam va'ed. You may be seated. Baruch atah Adonai Eloheinu melech haolam asher bidvaro maraviv aravim behachma poteach sharim uvitvuna meshana itim umahalif et hazmanim umsader et hakochavim b'mishmiro tehem barakia kirtzono borei yom v'layla golel or mipnei choshech v'chashech mipnei or umavir yom umevi Laila. Umavdil bein yom uvein Laila. Adonai tzvaot shemo. El chai v'kayam tamid yimloch aleinu le'olam va'ed. Baruch atah Adonai hamariv maravim. We turn to Ahavat Olam with great love. Ahavat Olam Beit Yisrael Amcha Ahavta. Torah umitzvot Chokim umishpatim, otanu lamadata. Al kain Adonai Eloheinu, b'sachbenu uvkumenu, nasiach bechukecha. V'nismach b'divrei Toratecha, umitzvotecha leolam va'ed. Ki heim chayenu, v'yorech yamenu, uvachem negeh yoman v'layla, v'ahavta al tasir mimenu liolamin, baruch atah Adonai, ohev amo Yisrael.
And we recite the Shema, we cover our eyes, we'll recite it with Matt, and then you can do the rest of it totally silently.
Oh, so will we have this out?
Well, you could do it if you want.
I'll do it. I will.
Okay.
Shema Yisrael Adonai Eloheinu Adonai Echad. V'ahavta et Adonai Elohecha bechol levavcha v'chol nafshecha uv'chol miotecha v'hayu hadvarim ha'ela asher anochi mitzavcha hayom al levavecha v'shinantam levanecha v'dibarta bam b'shiftecha b'veitecha uv'lechtecha haderech u'shafbecha uv'kumecha u'shartam liot al yedecha v'hayu l'totafot bein einecha uv'tavtam al mizot beitecha u'visharecha. We continue on page 5 in the Hebrew or 6 in the English silently. Adonai Elohim Emet. I'm turning to page 7 in Hebrew, 8. Halfway through the page, this morning Rabbi Sarah asked for an energetic Michamocha, but we're going to, I guess, be a little less energetic as we speak, but not sing.
A lot.
Okay, so I begin with Moses and the children of Israel. Moshe uvnei Yisrael lecha anu shira b'shimcha rabbah v'yamru kulam mi chamocha ba'elim Adonai mi chamocha nedar ba'kodesh Nora Tehila Osei Fela. Malchutecha Rau Benecha Bekoa Yam Lifnei Moshe Ze E Anu Viamru. Anoyim Loch Liolam Vaed. Veneamar Kifada Adonai Et Yaakov. Ugalo Meod Hazak Mimenu Baruch Ata Adonai Goel Yisrael. We turn to page 910. Why don't we sing the, not sing, why don't we speak the top paragraph together in English? Cause us, O Lord our God, to lie down in peace, and raise us up again, O our King, unto life. Spread over us thy tent of peace, direct us through thine own good counsel, save us for the sake of thine own honor, be thou a shield about us. Remove from us every enemy, sickness, sword, famine, and sorrow. Help us, O Lord, to resist temptation. Shelter us with thy protecting love, for thou art our guardian and our deliverer. O God and King, thou art kind and gracious. Guide our coming and going with life and peace, now and forevermore. Praised art thou, O Lord, who guardest thy people Israel forever. Okay.
Yeah, and we can skip.
Right to the Chatzi?
Yeah, we can go to the Hatzi Kaddish in the middle of page 11.
Okay. All right, so to page 11, again said, not sung. Yitkadal v'yitkadash shemei rabbah. Bialma di vra kirute, biamlich malchute, bechayechon uvyomechon, v'chayei dechol beit Yisrael, ba'agala uvizman kariv v'yimru. Amen. Yehesh meirah b'mivara l'olam amal. Yitbarach v'yishtabach v'yispar v'yisraman v'yisnasei v'yisadar v'yisalah v'yisalel shemei dekidusha brechu. Le'ela min kol bechata, v'shirata, tushbechata, v'nechemata, tamiron, v'alma, v'amru, amen. At this point, we rise for the silent Amidah.
And there's a special paragraph on the second page, either 15 or 16, that we say at the conclusion of Shabbat. So we add that in.
There is no rush. Take as much time as you need. But the silent Amidah ends on page 21 at the bottom with the first Hebrew song I think I ever learned in shul, but we'll say it, not sing it. Osei Shalom Bimromav, Hu Yaseh Shalom Aleinu V'al Kol Yisrael V'imru. Amen. Okay, should Kaddish? Okay. Yitgadal v'yitkadash shemei rabba. B'almo divra kirute v'amlich malchute v'chay echan v'yom echan v'chayhei t'chal beit Yisrael b'agala of zman kariv v'imru Amen. Together. Yehi Shmei Ra b'mavarach le'olam olamai almaya. Yitbarach v'yispar v'yisraman v'yisnaseh v'yisadar v'yisaleh v'yishalal Shmei dekedusha brechu. La'ela min kol becharta v'shirata tushbechata v'nechemata damiran v'yalma v'yimru. Amen. Titkabel tzalaton uvutchon dechol Yisrael kadam avuchon di v'shemaya v'yimru. Amen. Yehi shlama rabba min shemaya v'hayayim aleinu v'al kol Yisrael v'yimru. Amen. Oseh shalom bimromav hu yaseh shalom aleinu v'al kol Yisrael v'yimru. Amen. And on Saturday night we should add this blessing from Havdalah.
Yep. So we're gonna light candles. Shabbat is officially over.
Yep.
Right. Candles to two.
Second time's the charm. I'm going to block an event or something?
You can say the blessing and I'll just...
Okay. All right. So we are at the bottom of page 23. Baruch atah Adonai Eloheinu melech haolam borei me'orei ha'esh.
Amen.
Ha'esh meaning the fire.
All right. So we pause in the service to read from the book of Eicha. And I need 5 volunteers to read chapters in English. And they're pretty brutal. So
I'll take one.
we'll take one.
At least.
Okay. Yeah. Does anybody else? Bob? Okay. Anyone else want to read? Willing to read? Mom? Andy? Okay. So we've got 1, 2, 3, 4. I need one more reader.
I think-
Will be chapter. That's your chapters.
I think Eddie, did you have your hand up?
Eddie, 5.
Yeah.
Okay, Eddie, you're 5. Sorry, I didn't. Okay. So thank you, Matt. You can stay up here, but I'm gonna do some things with the lights as
Sure.
we sing Avinu Malkeinu.
Oh, so I have number 1 and then?
Yeah, you can
Okay.
do number 1 and then you'll stay up here. But I'm gonna read. So I'll read the first verses in the Eicha, and then Matt, or the English reader will read in English. You can come either up here or to the center, whatever's easiest. All
I'll leave after mine, so this space will be available if you
Right.
need it.
Okay. Avinu Malkeinu.
Page 26. Avinu Malkeinu, Aneinu, 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 Masi, Imanu, Tzedakah v'chesed, Imanu, Tzedakah v'chesed, She'enu. Avinu Malkeinu, Aneinu v'aneinu, Avinu Aneinu,
Aneinu v'aneinu, ki ein banu masi. You can see well enough to read, I hope, but not so well that it feels good in here. All right. So we've gathered to observe Tishah B'Av, which is a tragic day in the history of our people. We recall the 2 great tragedies, the destruction of the first and the second temples in Jerusalem. We recall the capture of Beitar, which was the last holdout in the Bar Kokhba revolt, and the end of the Jewish sovereignty and the hopes for Jewish sovereignty for nearly 2,000 years, but we kept that hope alive. We recall the expulsion of the Jews from Spain, and of course, in more recent memory, we recall the Holocaust and the trauma and the destruction to our people. May it be your will, Adonai our God, that all violence and tyranny and terror may cease. We pray for the day when people everywhere will turn to you and to live together in freedom and peace. And we say, Amen.
Amen.
Al narot Bavel, Al narot Bavel, Sham yashavnu gam bechinu, Sham yashavnu gam bechinu, Mizacharenu et Zion. By the waters of Babylon, we lay down and wept for thee, Zion. We remember thee, we remember thee, Zion. We remember thee, we remember thee, Zion. All right, so we're going to turn now to page 29 and then to page 30 for the first chapter of Eicha. Each chapter begins with the word Eicha, or how, or alas. Eicha yashva vadad, ha'ir rabati am haita ki almanana, rabati vagoyim, sarati b'medinot, haita lamas. Bachotiv ke bahalayla, v'dimata alechayeha, ein lamenachem mikol oaveha, kol reyeha bagduva, hayula le'oivim. Galta Yehuda me'one u'merov avodah, Hi yoshva vagoyim lo matzah manoach kol rodefet hiskihu ben hamtzarim. All right, and Matt, why don't you read chapter 1 from on page 30 from verse 1 and all the way through.
You got it, Rabbi. Thank you. So starting with verse 1 right there on page 30. How desolate lies Jerusalem, that was once full of people. She that was once a power among nations is now like a forlorn widow. She who was once a princess among peoples is now a vassal. Tears upon her cheeks, she weeps pitifully in the night. Of all her allies there is none to comfort her. All her friends have betrayed her and have become her enemies. Judah, that was in the rabbi's source sheet. 3. Judah is gone into exile. She dwells among the nations in poverty and servitude. She finds no peace. On the narrow roads her pursuers overtook her. The highways to Zion mourn. None come to assemble for the festival. All the gates of her cities are desolate. Her priests despair and her maidens are grieved. Ah, bitter is Jerusalem's lot. Her foes now rule. Her enemies prosper. For the Lord has punished her for her manifold transgressions. Her young people are led into captivity before the foe. Gone from Zion is all her splendor. Her leaders are as deer that find no pasture. Exhausted, they flee before their pursuer. In the days of her affliction and anguish, Jerusalem recalls all the treasures that were formerly hers. Now that her people fall helplessly into the hand of the enemy, her adversaries gloat over her downfall. Because Jerusalem has grievously sinned, she has become contaminated. All who once honored her now despise her, for they have seen her shame. She herself sighs and turns away from their gaze. Her corruption clung to her skirts. She considered not her future, and therefore she has fallen. Alas, there is none to comfort her. Behold, O Lord, my suffering, for the enemy has become arrogant. The enemy has carried away all her treasures. She has seen foreign nations enter her temple. Ah, yes, those very ones whom thou hast forbidden to enter therein. We turn to page 32 with verse 11. All her people languish, they search for bread. They barter their treasures for food in order to keep alive. See, O Lord, and behold how abject I have become. Let it not happen to you, all you who pass by. Behold, and see if there be any pain like the pain with which the Lord in his anger has afflicted me. From on high he has sent down a fever into my bones, and it has weakened me. He spread a net for my feet, and snaring me. He has left me faint and ridden with pain all day long. He has knit my sins one to the other, and pressed them upon my neck like a yoke, sapping my strength. The Lord has delivered me to an enemy over whom I cannot prevail. The Lord has made powerless all my mighty men. He has assembled an army against me to crush my young men. The Lord has trodden Jerusalem as in a winepress. For all this I weep, my eyes overflow with tears, for the Comforter who could bring me relief has deserted me. My children are desolate because the foe has prevailed. Zion stretches out her hands, but there is none to comfort her. The Lord has commanded that all those who surround Jacob should be his adversaries. Jerusalem is among them as one unclean. The Lord is righteous. I have rebelled against his commandment. Hearken, all you nations, and behold my pain. My maidens and my young men have gone into captivity. I called to my allies, but they have deceived me. My priests and my elders perished in the city as they searched for food to keep us alive. O Lord, consider my anguish. I writhe in pain, and my heart is turned within me, for I have wantonly rebelled. Outside, the sword slays. At home, death threatens. My foes have heard that I am helpless, and yet there is none to comfort me. They have heard of my plight, and rejoice that thou hast caused it. Aha, thou wilt bring the day which thou hast proclaimed, that day when their lot shall be like mine. Judge all their wickedness, and do unto them as thou hast done unto me for all my sins. For my sighs are many, and my heart is faint. Thank you.
We're on page 33, and it gets worse. Echa ya'iv be'apo Adoni et bat Zion, Hishlich mishamayim ma'eretz, Tiferet Yisrael, Below zachar dom raglav b'yom apo, Bal Adonai v'lo chamal, kol naod Yaakov, haras be'evrato, Mivtzarei vat Yehuda higia le'aretz, Chilel mamlacha v'sareha, Gada b'achrei af, Kol Keren Yisrael, Heshiva chor, Yemino mipnei oyev, Vayivar b'Yaakov. Oh, I missed a line. Missed a line. Haras bevrato, Mivtzarei vat Yehuda higia la'aretz, Chilel mamlacha v'sareha, Gada b'achrei af, Kol Keren Yisrael, Heshiva chor, Yemino mipnei oyev, Vayivar b'Yaakov ka'esh lahava, Ochola saviv. And we continue in English, chapter 2. You can go there if you. It doesn't matter. It's up to you. All right.
All right. Alas, how in his anger the Lord has covered Zion with a cloud. He has hurled Israel's glory from heaven to the earth, remembering not the temple on his day of indignation. The Lord unsparingly has ruined all the villages of Jacob in his wrath. He has leveled the fortresses of Judah. He has degraded her kingdom and her leaders. In fierce anger, he cut down the mighty ones of Israel. Before the enemy, he has withdrawn his own protection from his people. He has destroyed Jacob like a flaming fire which devours everything round about. He has bent his bow like an enemy, standing with right hand uplifted. He has slain all her cherished ones in the tent of Zion. He has poured out his fury like fire. The Lord has become like an enemy. He has brought ruin to Israel, destroying all her palaces and her fortresses, multiplying in Judah moaning and bemoaning. He has uprooted his temple as if it were a garden and demolished his place of assembly. The Lord has abolished in Zion both festival and Sabbath. In indignation, he has rejected king and priest alike. The Lord has discarded his altar and abhorred his temple to the enemy. He has handed over the walls of its palaces. In God's temple, the enemy hilariously shouts as if it were a day of festivity. The Lord planned to destroy the walls of Zion. He stretched out the line and did not withdraw his hand from destruction. He has made the rampart and wall mourn. They languish together. Her gates are sunk into the ground. He has broken their bars. Her king and leaders are exiled among the nations. The Torah is no more. Her prophets are bereft of divine vision. The elders of Zion sit mournfully upon the ground and are silent. They have covered their heads with dust and girded themselves with sackcloth. The maidens of Jerusalem bow their heads to the ground. My eyes grow weak from weeping. My heart is troubled. I am deeply pained for the destruction of my people, because young children and infants faint in the city streets. They cried to their mothers, "Where is corn and wine?" And they faint like wounded men, gasping out their lives in their mother's bosom. To what can I compare you? And to whom can I liken you, O Jerusalem? Whose misfortune can equal yours, that I might comfort you, O Zion? For your destruction is as vast as the ocean. Who can heal you? Your prophets have deluded you with false and foolish visions. They did not reveal to you your iniquity so that you might escape captivity. They devised for you oracles of falsehood and flattery. Passerby gloat over you. They hiss and toss their heads at the city of Jerusalem. Is this the city that men called the perfection of beauty, the joy of the whole earth? All your enemies open their mouths against you. They hiss and gnash their teeth and say, "We have swallowed her up." Certainly, this is the day for which we have longed. We have found it. At last, we have seen it. The Lord has carried out what he intended. He has fulfilled the threat which he made long ago. He has unsparingly destroyed and has caused the enemy to rejoice over you. He has brought triumph to the foe. Let your heart cry to the Lord, O wall of Zion, day and night. Let tears run down like a river. Give yourself no respite. Let not your eyes cease from weeping. Arise, cry out in the night at the beginning of each night watch. Pour out your heart like water before the Lord. Lift up your hands to him for the sake of your infants who faint from hunger in the streets. Behold, O Lord, and consider against whom hast done all these things. Are women to eat their children? The infants they have fondled? Are priest and prophet to be slain in God's temple? Young and old lie homeless in the streets. My maidens and my young men are fallen by the sword. Without pity hast thou slain them in the day of thy wrath. Thou hast called us in the day of assembly, my terror on every side. No one escaped or survived on the day of the Lord's anger. All whom I have nursed and nurtured, my enemy has destroyed.
Page 37. Ani hagever ra'oni b'shevet efrato oti nahag vayola choshech v'lo or ach bi yashuv yafoch yado kol hayom. And in English, this one's different. This is a 3-part alphabetical acrostic. Go ahead.
I am the man who has seen affliction under the rod of God's anger. He has led me and caused me to walk in darkness and not in light. He turned his hand against me again and again all day long. He has made my skin and my flesh old. He has broken my bones. He has heaped upon me bitterness and misery. He has placed me in the netherworld as those who have long been dead. He has fenced me in so I cannot go forth. He has made my chain heavy. Even when I cry and call for help, he shuts out my prayer. He has blocked my way with boulders and made my paths bewildering. He is to me like a bear lying in wait, as a lion in ambush. He has turned me away from my paths and pulled me in pieces. He has made me desolate. He has bent his bow and made me a target for his arrow. He has shot his arrows into my body. I have become a derision to all my people, the subject of their taunting all the day. He has filled me with bitterness and has sated me with wormwood. He has broken my teeth with gravel stones and covered me with ashes. I have no more peace. I have forgotten prosperity. And I said, God is my strength and my expectation from God. Remember my affliction and my anguish, which is like wormwood and gall. I still remember them and am bowed down, but this I recall, and therefore I have hope. The mercies of the Lord are not consumed. His loving compassions never fail. They are renewed every morning. Great is God's faithfulness. The Lord is my portion, I say, therefore I will hope in him. The Lord is good to those who have faith in him, to them that seek him. It is good to wait patiently for God's deliverance. It is good for a man that he be disciplined in his youth. Let him sit alone in silence when the Lord punishes him. Let him submit to his punishment. Perchance there is still hope. Let him turn his cheek to the oppressor and be filled with remorse. For the Lord will not forsake us forever. Though he cause grief, he will have compassion according to his abounding mercies. For he does not willingly afflict nor grieve the children of men, that prisoners be cruelly treated, that a man be deprived of justice before the Most High, that a man be defrauded of his legal rights. For all this the Lord disapproves. Who can bring anything about unless the Lord commands it? Or not evil and good alike decreed by the Most High? Why should mortal man complain when he is punished for his sins? Let us search and examine our ways and return to the Lord. Let us sincerely pray with our hearts unto God in heaven. We have sinned and we have rebelled, and therefore thou hast not pardoned. Thou hast covered thyself with anger and hast pursued us. Thou hast slain unsparingly. Thou hast covered thyself with a cloud, so that no prayer can pass through. Thou hast made us but offscouring and refuse among the nations. All our enemies have opened their mouth wide to denounce us. Terror and ensnarement have come upon us, desolation and destruction. My eyes overflow with tears because of the destruction of my people. My eyes overflow unceasingly and continually, until the Lord look down and behold from heaven. The sight of my people's misery in the city has caused me anguish. Without cause my enemies have hunted me as if I were a bird. They have imprisoned me in a dungeon and have cast a stone to cover up the pit. Water flowed over my head, and I said, I am cut off. Out of the lower depths I call upon thy name, O Lord. Thou heardest my voice. Hide not thine ear when I cry unto thee. Thou didst draw near when I called upon thee. Thou saidest, Fear not. O Lord, thou hast pleaded my cause and saved my life. O Lord, thou hast seen the wrongs done unto me. Judge thou my cause. Thou hast seen their vengeance and their evil designs against me. Thou hast heard, O Lord, all their reproaches and plots against me, the words of my attackers and their utterances against me all day long. Behold, how in their coming and going I am subject to their taunting songs. Punish them, O Lord, according to the evil they have done. Give them hardness of heart. May thy curse be upon them. Pursue them in anger and destroy them from under thy heaven.
Page 41. Echa yuam zahav, ishne ketem atov, tishpapechna avnei kodesh berosh kol chutzot, b'nei Tzion yekarim, hamsulaim b'paz. Echa nechshvu l'nivlei cheres, Maaseh yadei yotzer, Gam tanim chaltzu shad, Heiniku gurehen, Batami leachzar, Ki einahim bamidbar. Page 42. Who's doing chapter 4? Oh, Andy, go ahead. Yeah.
How the gold has become tarnished, how the purest gold has changed. The sacred gems are scattered in every street. The beloved sons of Zion, comparable as they were to fine gold, alas, they are now considered as mere earthen vessels, the work of potters. Even jackals draw out the breast and feed their young, but my people are cruel, like the ostrich in the wilderness. The tongue of the infant cleaves to his palate because of thirst. Young children ask for bread, and no one gives it to them. Those who were accustomed to feed on delicacies now languish in the streets. Those who rested on couches of scarlet now huddle on ash heaps. For the iniquity of my people is greater than the sin of Sodom, which was overthrown in a moment, too swiftly even for men to wring their hands. Her princes were purer than snow, whiter than milk. Their bodies were more ruddy than rubies. Their figures were like polished sapphires. Now their faces are darker than blackness. They are not recognized in the streets. Their skin is shriveled upon their bones, withered as a stick. Those who were slain by the sword are better off than those who perished of hunger. For the latter pine away, stricken by pangs of hunger for the fruit of the field. Women, formerly compassionate, have sodden their own children, consuming them as food during the destruction of my people. The Lord has poured out his fury and given vent to his fierce anger. He has kindled a fire in Zion, which has burnt her to the very foundation. Neither kings nor inhabitants of the earth could believe that the adversary and the enemy should ever enter the gates of Jerusalem. It is because of the sins of her prophets and the iniquities of her priests who have shed there the blood of the righteous. These prophets and priests wander blindly in the streets, stained with blood, so that men cannot touch their garments. Men shout to them, Begone, you are unclean. Begone, touch us not. When they fled away and wandered everywhere, men said, You shall not live here. The Lord himself scattered them. He will no longer care for them, for they did not respect the faithful priests, nor were they gracious to the elders. Our eyes failed as we looked in vain for help. On our watchtower, we watched for a nation that could not save us. The besiegers watch our every move so that we cannot go out into the streets. Our end is near, our days are numbered, our time has come. Our pursuers were swifter than the eagles of the heaven. They chased us upon the mountains and ambushed us in the wilderness. Our king, anointed of God, he of whom we said, Under his protection we shall live among the nations, was trapped in their pits. Rejoice and be glad with your short-lived triumph, O Edom, that dwells in the land of Uz. The cup of punishment will also be passed over to you, and you shall become debased and exposed to contempt. O Zion, you have paid for your sins. No longer will God cause you to be exiled. O Edom, God shall punish your iniquity and uncover your sins.
And we conclude with chapter 5, page 43. Zachar Adonai meheye lanu, Yabita ured cherpatenu, Nachletenu nehafecha lezarim, Batenu lenochrim, Yetomim hayinu ve'enav, Imotenu ke'almanot.
Consider, O Lord, what has happened to us. Behold and see our humiliation. Our land is given over to strangers, our homes to aliens. We are as fatherless orphans, our mothers are as widows. We paid dearly for the winter, we drink, and the wood we use. We pay dearly for the water we drink and the wood we use. We are pursued, and heavy is the yoke on our necks. We are weary and have no rest. To obtain bread, we have submitted to Egypt and to Assyria. Our fathers have sinned and are no longer among the living. We have borne the penalty of their guilt. Slaves rule over us, and there is none to rescue us. We obtain our bread at the peril of our lives because of the sword in the wilderness. Our skin glows like an oven because of the feverish heat of famine. They have ravished the women of Zion, the maidens in the cities of Judah. Nobles are hung by them, and elders are outraged. Young men are forced to grind at the mill, and children stagger under loads of wood. Gone are the elders from the gates, and young men from their music. Gone are all the delights of our hearts. Our dancing has turned into mourning. The crown of glory has fallen from our head. Woe unto us, for we have sinned. For all this our heart is faint. Because of these things our eyesight is dim. Foxes roam about the desolate mountains of Zion. Thou, O Lord, shalt reign forever. Thy throne is for eternity. Why dost thou forget us forever and forsake us for so long? Turn us unto thee, O Lord, that we may return. Restore our days as of old. Thou hast utterly rejected us. Thou hast been exceedingly angry with us. Turn us unto thee, O Lord, that we may return. Restore our days as of old.
And I'm at the bottom at verse 21. Hashivenu Adonai elecha v'nashuva chadesh yameinu kekedem ki imaos mastanu katafta leinu ad meod. Hashivenu Adonai elecha v'nashuva chadesh yameinu kekedem. And we turn, that's Echa, pretty grim. We turned terrible. We turn now to page 48 for Elitzion, top of page 48. Elitzion v'yareha kemo isha v'tzireha v'chivtu lach aguratzak al ba'al nureha alei armon asher nitash be'ash matzon arareha ve'al biyad mechar fe'el b'toch mikdash charareha alei tzion v'yareha kemo isha v'tzireha v'chivtu lacha guratzak al ba'al nureha ale galud misharte el meni meshizimreha ve'al damam asher shupach kemo me'em yureha ale tzihon v'yareha kemo isha ve'yitireha v'chivtu lacha guratzak al ba'al nureha. In just a moment, we'll conclude our service, but before we do that, we'll read the second poem, How To, Echa, right? How To. So it's the back of your white sheet. How to hold fear. For so long, my shoulders learned a new shape. How to watch numbers climb higher and then higher. How to hold funerals and kindergarten over Zoom. How to read subtle signs via eyes alone. How to regrow scallions in water because there might not be more to buy. How to feel our connections though we're apart. How to sit with unimaginable losses even if they aren't our own, even if they are. How to hold each other when we can't touch. How to weep. How to feel everything that's broken, from mobile morgues to the lies that fueled shattered Capitol windows and then asked the grief and fury to drain away. How to nurture hope's tiny tendrils, unfurling into flower with every vaccination. How to trust each other to take down our veils and blink in unfamiliar sun. And we'll conclude with Kaddish Shalem on page 51. So Matt will get you back up here. And then the strangest Aleinu ever, where we just say it, up until Baruch Hu, and then Mourner's Kaddish. So for now, we're on page 51 in the middle of the page.
Thank you, Rabbi. Yiskadal v'yiskadash shemei rabbah. Bialma diavra kirute, biamlich malhute, b'chayechon uv'yomechon, v'chayei dechol beit Yisrael, b'agalav v'zman kariv v'yimru. Amen. Yehei shema rabbi mevarach le'olam, le'olmei almaya. Yisbarach v'yispar v'yisroman, v'yisnaseh v'yisadar, v'yisalah v'yisalel, shemo dekadisha brachu. Le'ela min kol bechata, V'shirata, tushbechata, v'nechemata, tamiram bialma, v'yimru, amen. Yehei shlama rabba min shemaya, v'hayim, aleinu v'yal kol Yisrael, v'yimru, amen. Osei shalom, b'morav, hu yaseh shalom, aleinu v'yal kol Yisrael, v'yimru, amen.
We rise for Aleinu, page 53.
I guess we can try this together, but we can't sing, so let's do our best. Aleinu l'shebeach l'adon hakol l'tate gedulo liotzer breshit shelo asanu kegei hayaratzot v'lo samanu k'mishpachot ha'adama shelo sam helkenu kahem v'gohor aleinu kechol hamonam v'anachnu korim mishtachavim modim lifnei melech malchei hamlachim hakadosh baruch hu. Shehudan Teshamayim v'yosei aretz v'moshav yikaro b'shamayim mimal v'shvinatu zo b'gavahei meromim hu Eloheinu ein od emet malkeinu efes zulato kakatu b'torato v'yadata hayom v'yahashavata el levavecha ki Adonai hu ha'Elohim b'shamayim mimal v'yal haaretz mitachat ein od. We continue silently. Colon, the 3 lines from the bottom. V'ne'emar v'chaya Adonai lamelech al kol haaretz bayom ha'oi echad u'shemo echad.
And at this time, I invite those who are in mourning or observing a yortzeit to remain standing. Yitkadal v'yikadash shemei rabbah. בעלמא מלכותי, בחייכון וביומכון ובחיי דכל בית ישראל, בעגלה ובזמן קריב אמרו אמן. יהי שמי רבה מברך לעולם ועולמי עלמיה. יתברך וישתבח ויפאר ויתרומם ויתנשא, ויתהדר ויתעלה ויתהלל שמי דקודשה בריחו. לעילה מן כל ברכתה ושירתה, תושבחתה ונחמתה, תאמירן בעלמא ואמרו אמן. יהי שלמה רבה מן שמיה, וחיים עלינו ועל כל ישראל ואמרו אמן. עושה שלום במרומיו, הוא יעשה שלום עלינו ועל כל ישראל ואמרו amen. And we'll conclude in just a moment with one of the supplementary readings. But Yasher Koach to Matt, thank you all for coming. On the way out, we have to just all write down names of who was here, so just in case there's a contact tracing needed. Yasher Koach to Matt, thank you Andy and Alan for opening the shul, and to everybody who read, and thanks for braving this storm. I'm on page 58, a Tishah B'Av reflection. Dear God, so much innocent bloodshed. We're supposed to be created in your image, but oh, how we have distorted it. When we read of the beastly acts of some, we are ashamed to be human. When we read of the nobility of their victims, we are proud to be Jews. If there's anything for which we can be grateful, it's that we have been the victims, not the murderers, the persecuted, not the persecutors. But must cruelty always be? Must inhumanity ever be the signature of mortals? No, we refuse to accept that. We refuse to give hatred the last word because we have known the power of love. We refuse to believe that cruelty will prevail because we have felt the strength of kindness. We refuse to award the ultimate victory to evil because we believe in you too much. So help us, O God, to live by our faith. Where there's hatred, may we bring love. Where there's pain, may we bring healing. Where there's darkness, may we bring light. Where there's despair, may we bring hope. Where there is discord, may we bring peace. Make this a better world, O Lord. Pray with us. Hashivenu Adonai Uva, Chadesh Yameinu,